It is indeed a great pleasure to be here to spend this time together to reflect on the witness of faith within the world. And we're doing so in a place which is very significant for the Archdiocese of Toronto, which I am the bishop. Just a little bit down the lakeshore from here, where there now is the island airport. Many years ago, just shortly after this archdiocese was founded, 40,000 immigrants and refugees arrived on the shores of Toronto, a town at that time which had only 20,000 people. And that experience of the coming of those refugees from natural disaster, they were Irish from the potato famine in Ireland, but also from political disaster too, because there was certainly woven into their experience of the natural disaster and maybe the incompetence which had led to the depending upon one form of food, but also there's a fair degree of persecution, one might say, or rejection as well. So it was a mixture, as is so often the case with people who are fleeing their homeland. To some degree it was a natural thing, but it was also made worse because of human activity. So they came here, and they came with great suffering. And that experience is what has marked our archdiocese in its very foundation. Michael Power, our young bishop, I think I'm very young because I'm 71 and he was only 42. Michael Power had only been named to be bishop a few years before. He was in his 30s when he became a bishop. He had noticed the need in the diocese for more priests and also for various religious sisters and others to help in his small frontier diocese. So in the springtime of 1847, he headed over to Europe to see if he can get some help for his diocese. And as he was passing through Ireland, he saw the horrible devastation which was being suffered by the people of that country. And he realized that very, very many of them would be heading west across the Atlantic, seeking refuge from their sorrows and their suffering. If you want to see what that looked like, if you have a chance to go to Dublin, along the River Liffey as it's heading out to sea, you'll see a series of statues by a great artist, which shows the suffering Irish people as they left their homeland, as so many people have done and are doing now in this world. So many people have had to flee the place in which they were born and which they were raised. So we see the sadness on their faces as they leave their homeland forever, as it would turn out for all of them. And some of them made it to Canada, and many died on the way. But what you can more easily see, if you just drive short distance down the lakeshore here, just as you go to the island airport, turn left and walk a few feet, you'll see Ireland Park. And there's a great monument to those who came. And there are more statues by the same artist. But this time they are utterly haggard, suffering, hardly anything left after their experience of that ocean journey. That's what they were like when they came here on the shores of Lake Ontario in that terrible summer of 1847. And many of them had typhus. And so Bishop Power, using his organizational ability, which had him made a bishop in his mid-30s, and his great love for the people, he organized the fever sheds where they could be cared for, and alas, many of them died. Also part of this, and something I think is important on an occasion like the World Parliament of Religions, certainly he took a leading role, but so did many of the Anglicans, the Methodists, the other people of this community. They joined together, although in those days there was often rather fascinating and fractious relationships among Catholics and Protestants around the world. But in those days of the great suffering of that summer, all the different people came together to reach out and welcome those 20,000 people of Toronto, to welcome the 40,000 suffering immigrants who came unexpected and unannounced to their shores. And I think that speaks to us of what we often see. In the midst of darkness and tragedy, in the midst of great evil, people rise to the occasion, and the love shines brighter and brighter amid the darkness of hatred and of suffering and of pain. And that's what certainly was experienced in the terrible summer of 1847, which is engraved in the memory of this diocese certainly, and certainly within the history of our city here. those people who suffered so much. And yet they were surrounded, as they came here, with love that conquered religious divisions and led people together to care for them, and many to give their lives for them. Many of the doctors, the nurses, the people who were helping them as they came off the boats, they themselves caught the typhus and died, as indeed did Bishop Power, because on October the 1st, 1847, after his months of caring for the suffering immigrants who arrived here, he himself died of typhus and is buried underneath the sanctuary of our cathedral. I think there are two buildings that symbolize our great and holy first bishop. One of them is indeed the cathedral, because he did what he did because of love and hope and faith. But his love flowed from his hope and his faith. Because of his faith, he saw the vision of God and the provident hand of God. That gave him the energy of hope to do what he did in the midst of extraordinary human obstacles. And that bore fruit in the love he showed when day after day he would walk from his residence, where I now live, here to this lakeshore, to care for those who were dying. Faith gives the vision. Hope gives the strength. But it must bear fruit in love, as it did in that terrible summer. And yet a summer terrible in the suffering that those endured, but glorious in the love which it brought forth among the many people of different faiths who rose to that occasion and cared for the people who came unannounced and unexpected in their midst. Well, I think that speaks to us of what we need to be as we work together, people of different faiths, but confronted with a crisis, we very often are what's brought out of us is the best in us, whereas sometimes there's so much squabbling and fighting. But in the face of the struggle and the suffering, the very best came forth in the people of Toronto, and our first bishop really led the way in that. Very often, to be canonized or declared a saint, you need to have either been a martyr, and there are so very many martyrs around the world. One of the reasons there are so many refugees in these days is persecution and martyrdom. Or perhaps you need to have founded a religious order or done something of that nature. But the Vatican has created a new category of martyr, a new category of saint, the martyr of charity. It is for people like Michael Power, who, and I'd say also Sister Delphine Fontbonne, the founder or the first sister of the St. Joseph Sisters. And I would say also the 5 Loretto sisters, who in September of 1847, just before Michael Power died, he had invited them to come over, and he didn't think they'd be so quick. But they were over in a short time, and in September he was expecting them much later, but there they were, on the doorsteps of the rectory, where I now live. And I had the great honor just last year to come out of the door of the rectory, of the bishop's residence, and greet the superior, the Mother General of the Loretto Sisters of the World, as she and her colleagues came at that very place where, in September of 1847, Bishop Power, my predecessor, met their predecessors as they came to care for those who were in need. All of those sisters were in their 20s or early 30s. And within a few years, all of them were dead as well because of their caring for the sick and the needy. And they are, if you go into, which I highly encourage for visitors to our city, go to visit the Cathedral of St. Michael, which was the great dream of Michael Power. If you go down underneath, well, look first of all up above, it's a very beautiful place, but go down below. Directly under the sanctuary is the tomb of Michael Power. And at the introduction, the front part of the chapel below, are the tomb of the 4 Loretto sisters who are buried there and who are a sign of the religious women who have been such a tremendous example and model for all of us in our life. And so we're seeking to have certainly Michael Power canonized. We'll start with that, but I think the religious sisters also, we should begin a cause for their canonization as well. But it's taking time. We're starting with Michael Power. We know more about him at the start. But I think, indeed, that we should do that for so many people who have given their life for caring for people in need. And they were refugees. They were immigrants, they were refugees really from the suffering in Ireland at the time. And as we look into the faith of Christians, we look back beyond that, the individual experiences of a diocese. We look back to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, fleeing, refugees, fleeing to Egypt. They are the ones who sought refuge in the land of Egypt, and there they are for us, I think, as Christians, the model of what we seek to do in welcoming the stranger. As they were welcomed by foreigners, by people who did not know them, as Michael Power and Sister Delphine and Mother Delphine and the Loretto sisters, as well as St. Joseph, welcomed the stranger to these shores and gave their lives for that. So too, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were welcomed in Egypt and found refuge from violence. As the refugees of the 1840s were fleeing from famine, but also some persecution, certainly Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were fleeing from death, from violence. And so very many of the people we face today are doing that. So it is a commitment of this Archdiocese to care for the stranger, as it is indeed for all of us in different ways. But I can only speak perhaps most fully of the Archdiocese of Toronto. Since I've been the Archbishop here, I've tried to emphasize more and more the care for the stranger who comes into our midst. This is very appropriate because of our history, as I've just described. It is in our DNA, you might say, to welcome the refugee and give refuge to the one fleeing the evils of this valley of tears. But also, I think it's particularly appropriate in this city, because our city is made up of many, many people who have fled from horrible evils and persecution around the world. I think particularly of our Chaldean community from Iraq. The Catholics of Iraq, there once were well over 1 million, many, many, many more, now very few, because they've been driven out of their homes and they have sought refuge, sometimes in Lebanon, sometimes in Syria. And now people, of course, are being driven out of Syria, so they're in great suffering. When Neil mentioned that we offer Mass in over 30 languages, that's true, but that's only in the Latin part of the Church, the Western part. We also have within our community people of the Eastern churches, Eastern Catholic and also, of course, the Eastern Orthodox churches. One of the groups that is most in the mind, if we think of people suffering persecution and seeking refuge in our land, are the Coptic people, because just last week, 3 buses of pilgrims were on their way to a monastery in the desert, and one of the buses they stopped and they killed the people on it. So we have a Coptic Catholic parish here, and we have a very large Coptic Orthodox community here. And too many times, I must sadly say, I have had the sad duty and the honor of going to the Coptic Cathedral in Mississauga to pray for those who have been killed and who have suffered. So that is the world in which we live. In the midst of all that evil and violence, we need to provide refuge and help. And so it motivates us all, and people of many different faiths. We work together in refugee work. I speak, of course, for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Toronto, but we work together with many different faiths. I think particularly many of the Eastern Orthodox churches who cooperate together with our Office of Refugees of the Archdiocese of Toronto. I think it's so wonderful that the acronym that we used for it, ORAT, is He Prays, which is wonderful. ORAT, O-R-A-T. It's He Prays, and in Latin. And so that's what we have. We have a very large office and one that's very dedicated, very expert in not only helping to bring people here, but to work together in cooperation with the government, which is seeking in many different ways to provide in Canada a refuge for people in the midst of the storm of suffering and persecution and many other violent and difficult things that people face. So we work with them, but also ORAT works together as well with the different churches, and not only helps them directly, but also indirectly by helping put on presentations and things and giving advice in the complexity of bureaucracy which is required if one is going to actually bring people here. One of the things which we find to be particularly important as we do this, we very much support the way others are doing this, but we believe that with those who are the voluntary groups, the people, the faith groups, parishes of different churches and faiths, when they help people coming to our shores, they do so not only with money, because they're required obviously to help subsidize the first year of those who have come here from their homeland, but also with love. Love is not easily produced. It can't be put in a book or something like that. It can't be put on a budget. But love is what really makes the difference. And love is there in abundance. 167 of our parishes have refugee sponsorship teams and groups which care for those when they come. They go out to the airport. They're there to welcome them. And many people of other faiths do something similar. I only speak for what I'm familiar with. But we're very involved in that. In fact, our office of the Archdiocese, I guess I was technically the one who was sponsoring the family. It was really the people of the office who did all the work and cared, the Makou family. They're a wonderful family that came from Iraq after many years of being delayed in the passage from their home to their new home here in Toronto. And of course, they shouldn't have to have done that. It would have been so much better if they could stay where their home is. You know, our goal is not to, we want to help people who must flee their home, but the real goal is to help people be able to flourish joyfully in their home. And so that's another side of this that we need to reflect upon. And so we do have a very good system put together to help people who come to this land. And I think it is something that enriches our community very much. We do need to support them financially through the course of the year, but what we find is because of the involvement of people taking our newcomers to various classes and various things like that, and because of the networks of support which we can provide, that normally the people who come have a job very soon, often certainly far less than a year, maybe half a year if that, because they've had a lot of support. And so I think what we need to do is to build that kind of support within the community. And that's the kind of way in which people of many different faiths, just as they did in the days of Michael Power, whom we are seeking to have declared Saint Michael Power, just as he did in those days, people of many faiths, mainly various Christian faiths in Toronto in 1847, they worked together to welcome the people who came to our shore. So too now, this is a place where we can work together, and we are doing so. Each different refugee group is helping others to do that. There's a tremendous amount of mutual cooperation. It's so true that in the faith, the hope, and the love, we have different, very serious and very real and substantial differences on issues of faith. But on the example of love, that brings us together. And I think that is something that we hope will be able to work backward and help us to work out in a spirit of friendship and cooperation the various substantial differences that are there in faith, because they're not illusory differences, they're very substantial and real, and they matter. But while we're working that out, we get to work and help people. And as we do that, first of all, we're doing what unites us all, the example of practical love, the service, as we put in the Christian tradition, the washing of the feet at the Last Supper by Jesus. That is for us the most sublime of all the Gospels is the Gospel of John. And at the description of the Last Supper, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe the institution of the Eucharist, St. John does that earlier in chapter 6 of his Gospel. He deals with the Eucharist. But he speaks of the fact that Jesus took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around him, and washed feet, which was in those days a sign of extraordinary humiliation. It was something that was a very lowly thing to do. And here he said, I, you call your master and Lord, if I am washing your feet, you must do that for others. And one of the people, I just thought of this a few days ago when I was meditating upon it, one of the people, one of the 12 apostles whose feet Jesus washed was Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And it's several times referred to in the description of the washing of the feet that Judas was there. And right after that, Judas leaves. And it says, Satan entered into him, and it was night. And he leaves. And yet we are called together, I think, to all of us in different ways with different expressions and understandings of faith, joined together by that practical service in which God's love becomes real and incarnate in our midst. And that's something which I think unites us all in our different faith traditions. And so we're called to do that, and I think it is happening. It's a sign of hope in a world where there is so much violence. And I remember once when there was a particularly violent incident, not as we saw so terribly in Pittsburgh recently against the Jewish community, or as we saw just a few days after that against the Christian community in Egypt, but rather against the Muslim community when there was a terrible attack on a mosque in Quebec. One of the political leaders called me and urged believers to work together. I think he may have been under the impression that believers are intent on doing this to one another. And that's just not so. The people who do these things do evil. And I told him that when I was Archbishop of Edmonton, I joined together with Saul Rollinger of the Jewish community and Larry Shaban of the Muslim community to create with them, I follow their lead and their example, the Phoenix Project, which helped people of different faiths, Jewish, in that case, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, to work together whenever any one of them was being attacked, and to help, apart from those tragic moments, to help build understanding among the different members of their different faiths. This actually started when both the cathedral on Jasper Avenue and the synagogue further down were firebombed in the same afternoon. And so it was an occasion to wake up and realize the need for that kind of cooperative effort. And so out of something, as indeed happens in all of these incidents, out of so much hatred and evil, as we've seen in the Pittsburgh horror of that, we see many people stepping forward to express their love and their desire that this shall not triumph, this kind of evil shall not triumph. And that's something that often gives rise, it must give rise to a new practical experience of love. It doesn't always do that. It can lead to greater hatred and things like that. But our role is to be sure that it goes in the direction of a deeper love rather than go off course into a kind of an intensified hatred or division. So those are some of the experiences, I think, within our own archdiocese. Several years ago, I was in Rome, and I was at several meetings. I go from time to time there. After I've been made a cardinal, I'm on various departments. I'm on the Cardinal's Commission for the Vatican Bank, which is an interesting position to have. I'm on the Congregation for Education, the Department of Education over there. I'm on the Department of the Eastern Churches, because in this diocese we have many of the 22, I don't know, people who are not Catholics may not be aware that the Catholic Church is made up of, I think it's 22 churches. One of the biggest one is the Roman Catholic Church. All of them except the Pope as their spiritual leader ultimately, but there are many different ones. And in our diocese here, we have the Chaldean Catholics, who are Iraqi Catholics. We have the Syro-Malabar, who are from India, Syro-Malankara from India, the Melkites. We have the Maronites from Lebanon. I'm going to forget some. We have the Eritrean rite, the Israelite. We have the Coptic Catholics, Syriac Catholics, and so many others. I will not remember them all. So I'm also on the Congregation for Eastern Churches, which gives a particular importance to welcoming the stranger. Because many of these churches, because of their location, are themselves vulnerable and are often being driven away into great suffering. They are here. Why do we have in Toronto, and it's true in North America as well, other places, Why do we have a flourishing communities of Coptic Christians and many others? Well, the reason we do is because they've been driven from where they want to be, where they originally came from. I think that's also true in different ways of other groups, but I think it's a thing we need to welcome. As we welcome people, we also need to look to ways in which we can exercise what influence we might have, which is not really maybe that strong, to reach out to people in distant lands, to hope that in those distant places that they might be able to work together and might not suffer the kind of suffering so many people of different faiths are facing. That is a very real problem which many people of faith experience around the world. And so we seek, I think, to try to do that. And so one of the ways in which that happens is that when I was in Rome at one of the meetings of these groups I'm on, one of the cardinals called me to a lunch, and he said, we need to have a representative on the International Catholic Migrant Commission, which is where the Catholic Church's refugee service for the whole church, not just we have a ORAT, which is our smaller one, local one. And it's been going for many, many years. It was founded, I think, way back in the 1930s or 40s. And it works with refugees, with the United Nations, with many others around the world. And he said, there should be a representative from Canada on this council. And I said, oh, what do you want, a priest or maybe a bishop? And he said, no, a cardinal. I thought, oh, I looked around and I found, well, I guess that was me. So so I've been on that commission now for many years. Unfortunately, I'm not able, because they call meetings rather rapidly, I'm not able to get to the meetings that much, which is probably a good thing, because I think what they would want from me is more just to say that there's a cardinal supporting them, but I don't really know that much about the details. So I'm very happy that they've allowed me to name as my delegate to the actual meetings Deacon Rudy Ovchak, who's the head of the Office of Refugees, the Archdiocese of Toronto, who is able to represent me in a certain sense, but really knows much more the reality on the ground of helping refugees and helping them to find a place of peace after their land has been, their homes have been destroyed. So this is something, whether it goes from, again, I speak only from the Christian perspective, from Jesus, Mary, and Joseph seeking refuge in Egypt, to people down through the ages doing this, to the Irish refugees who were the foundation of this diocese, to the many others down more recently. And I think there's never probably been a time of more violence and suffering. People who are on the move across the world, driven out of their homes, many people. We think also the Rohingya people who are also suffering. We think of many others who are facing this terrible evil. And often when they go to a neighboring country, as we see with some of our Christian brothers and sisters, they go to a neighboring country and seek to find refuge there, and sometimes they find there isn't refuge there. They actually suffer again. And so you expect to escape, and they're not really. So it's a whole struggle. And I think, what can we do in the face of such suffering, in the face often of such evil, which causes the people to leave? What can we do? It is so overwhelming. Well, I think some of the things we can do. We can't really change policies and the marching of armies and things like that, or the actions of terrorists, which often trigger these things. We can pray that that may stop, but it's very difficult. We can put some pressure on the government, and if the government where this is happening is anyway amenable to pressure, it might help a bit. Sometimes just making it known helps a bit. But really what we need to do is, where we can, where there is an opening in the distant land where this is happening, we can help out to give people the chance to stay in their homes where they want really to stay. This is where I would say, not only do we have the Office of Refugees and the Vatican Refugee Service, but we have groups such as the Catholic Near Eastern Welfare Association. This is a very important group which just began in its activities in Canada a few years ago. And what it does is it tries to help people in their homeland economically and physically in many different ways, so that they will, often it's an economic thing as well, so that they won't be able to stay where they want to be. They shouldn't have to leave their home, and they can stay where they are. We also have another group which is beginning its work just a short time ago, the Aid to the Church in Need. Felipe Bizarra is starting that right here in Toronto. Its headquarters in Canada are in Montreal. And in November, I'm not sure when in November, late November, I think it's the 10th or what? 21st, November the 21st, we're going to be having a prayer service at the cathedral. And they have a tradition of, we have kind of lighting up buildings in red as a sign of the blood of those who have suffered. And we will be doing that with our cathedral on November 21st. And we'll be having a time of prayer when people come together to pray for those who are suffering such great evils in their life. And so I'd invite everyone who wishes to participate in that to join in that time of prayer. So these are activities which we can undertake, but they are obviously limited. But one thing good done improves the world. I remember thinking of Mother Teresa when facing such horrible struggles that she faced, so many evils and things around her. So what to do? Well, one good deed at a time, and especially when working together with people of other faiths, can be magnified enormously. She said, I can just drop a pebble in the water and let the ripples spread out and out. So I think our role, in a sense, is keep dropping those pebbles in the water. In the good that Michael Power did, and the good that Sister Mother Delphine Fontbonne and the others did, and the Loretto sisters who came, and the many lay people who have helped the refugees in this area, that good has rippled out through time. It's had an extraordinary benefit. Although, and anyway, we can't just dream, think globally, we have to act locally. And if enough people do that, then it has a profound change. It causes enormous good within our own society. And I think that's what we all seek to do. So this is a reality in the local diocese. And I've spoken of the broader Catholic Church and the Vatican Refugee Service, which I'm on the board at least, although I'm not as involved as I would like to be. And I think those are two dimensions. It's important that we work together with many people of different faiths. And I think if we do so, we can lead to a real change in this world and help people to be what they're called to be. And so maybe I just simply ask any people who might have any questions or comments or anything. And we don't have a microphone system so well, so if you would maybe speak loudly and we could hear. Okay.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your
okay,
work
sure.
with
okay.
this. And I'm from Charleston, South Carolina.
Right.
And I was amazed. I've been there now for about 17 years, and I was amazed one year, about 8 years ago, to see the bishops from all the various dioceses, Anglican, Lutheran, United Methodist, and Catholic, all do a march on a major street downtown in Charleston in support of an immigration issue that was going on at the time. And so my question is there such a thing as all of the bishops and cardinals from the various traditions? Because this seems to be an issue that many of the bishops and cardinals agree upon, that they could all write a letter to the President of the United States with regard to the caravan that's coming up, or you can pick whichever immigration issue you like. But is there such a thing as that happening, where all the bishops and cardinals write together a letter to somebody like that?
Well, thank you for that very pertinent question, which deals with a lot of suffering that's happening right now, and it's what practical action can we take? I think the goal is always to welcome the stranger and to be there. We have to always discern what is actually happening, and sometimes we don't know. We may think this is a refugee, and it may not. So there has to be a certain prudential decision, thinking clearly as well. But we do need to reach out. I have never been one for writing letters. Just personally, I just speak only from the heart, okay, from my own experience. I'm regularly asked to sign joint letters, and I never do. I don't think I've ever signed a joint letter. And the reason I don't is I'd rather work in another way. I think, I find for one thing, when there are joint letters of that nature, I don't think they actually have the impact that the person might wish. Now, there might be a good benefit in getting the signers of the letter to get together. That might have a benefit at that level. But I think in terms of actually moving the thing in the direction one wants, I'm just not so sure it's effective. So it would not be for a reason of lack of goodwill. I'm saying more a question of just a decision of a judgment call on the effectiveness of that approach. What I think is, and again, I'm not all that familiar with what I'm most familiar with is the situation in Canada, so I don't have competence to comment on what particular issue might be in another country. But what we have found is that a slow and steady building of a relationship with the government over decades, with the political leadership, but also really with the administration, not administration in the sense of like government that way, but I mean the bureaucracy, the civil service, that doing that over time is a very effective way of helping quietly. And many times there's been much fruit in that approach, which what it tends to do, and I find this in many other issues in my own mission as a bishop, if you do something publicly, it tends to make people seize up and hunker down in whatever their position is. It's often better to do it in a more indirect way so that they'll not be so resistant, let's say. People become very defensive if you kind of come at them. Actually, it's a wonderful thing, like Nathan. When David killed Uriah the Hittite, instead of the prophet saying to him, you've done that, which is true, he did it, rather to tell the story and try to go around indirectly. So I would say my general approach would be more indirect. The other thing is that I don't know about other churches, I can't again speak for them, but in the Catholic Church, it's not as well organized as what you would describe. I don't think we could get a bunch of people together in one thing, just as a practical matter. I remember once when I was in Rome, my first as a student, I was there in the 1970s, and one person had just arrived from Canada, and he said, the Pope gives the order, the cardinals take it to the archbishops to the bishops, and so on, and then it works. And I said, well, I don't think that's quite the way it works. There's a whole bunch of, it's very difficult to get that kind of coordinated action too. It's another issue. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that was a very similar question.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Steve. I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Right.
And so at the very launch of the Parliament, one of the speakers, Jim Wallace, maybe you know Jim from
No.
Washington, D.C. area, he was speaking about a movement that would indeed welcome the stranger at the border of the United States and Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
a movement of all faiths. But I have Catholic background, and I also have done some travels in the Central American area and recognize that a great deal of those people that are coming are indeed Roman Catholic
Mm-hmm.
in their own spiritual orientation to life. And it seems to me, in terms of like the sanctuary that the church represents, to take in those who are part of the same faith community, irregardless of the politics.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there is the responsibility to discern if in the middle of those refugees there are people that are
Like violent or something, yeah.
responsibility in
Mhm.
churches already.
Right, yeah.
We have that responsibility to discern who are the wolves that are coming in to harm them, who are the Judases. Nevertheless, I appreciate what you said. There is the washing of the feet of Judas,
Mm-hmm.
who will turn around and betray Jesus. But it's interesting that the role of Jesus in that was with recognition that would happen, to
Mhm.
still wash his feet.
Yeah.
As a sign, and I believe that what you already spoke prophetically is that this is a sign that we have right now. We have
Mhm.
a sign of Christ welcoming those,
Mhm.
like Matthew 25,
Yeah.
the way that the sheep and the goats
Mhm.
get separated.
Mhm.
Have to do with this very phenomenon.
Whatever you do for the least of my brothers and sisters when I was hungry, that's very true. It really struck me when I was rereading the thing about the washing of the feet. I had never noticed it before. You see something 100 times and never see that point. Just visualizing Jesus in this very humiliating thing, which somebody once suggested that may have finally been the last straw for Judas. He wanted this master, and here the master was washing his feet. He said, this is not the kind of master I want. I don't know whether that's true or not, but whatever it is, he could see, and obviously Jesus knew what Judas was going to do, and Judas knew Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. It's obvious in their conversation a bit later when Jesus says, whatever what you're going to do quickly. And so you can see the look of their eye to eye as they were. Then he left, and it was night. So that is very true, that you do face the fact, and certainly at the very heart of certainly of Christian faith, it is, in a sense, it goes counterintuitive that you would think you would only be for people who are going to help you and so on, but that he did that for the one he knew would betray him is itself a very powerful thing of what we need to do, and calls us to take that risk of faith. But at the same time, of course, obviously, a legitimate, quite legitimate role of a government, any government that's a good government, a legitimate role is to protect the people against people who might kill them or do something like that. So it is that balancing kind of a thing. Again, I don't know. We there in that case, as you say, most of the ones in that would probably be Catholics, I suppose. Most of the ones who came here were Catholic, but not all. And people of what happened there was actually a different thing. Michael Power was helping Catholics and Presbyterians and Anglicans, and the Anglicans were helping Catholics and Presbyterians and Anglicans, so were the Presbyterians. So in a sense, one of the things they're reaching out to was they're helping people of another faith. But you're right, it probably is true in that case, they would be. Again, I don't want to simply dodge a question, but American, of course today's a big day for American political things. I really am not in a, I remember I was sitting with my sister at a hotel once having dinner, and a couple actually we went on a little vacation together and we were in Europe, and this, I think it was a German husband and an Austrian wife, they heard us talking English. This is about a year or two ago, and they asked us what we thought about the leadership of the United States, and we, truly cowardly as Canadians can sometimes be, we said, well, we don't know, we're Canadian, we don't know. So, who knows, I don't know. And so I'm afraid we took the, you might say, the cowardly way out. So I certainly think this is a day today is an important day for the United States, for American people. So we pray for wisdom among the voters and pray for the whole country. And especially because we here as Canadians, we're neighbors of, we have an unusual situation. We're sort of looking through the window of the United States all the time. And we sometimes go in the house and out again, but we're not there. But we certainly pray for our American brothers and sisters that this is an important day in their life as a country. As these many others in the future too, but I just hope that whatever will be of benefit to everyone. Here we have a different situation. We're a smaller country, like in people, not in size. And here too we have differences with the government, political leaders, different governments. And it takes a different, I think, feel to what I sensed in watching television is the feel of the United States. But it's quite intense as well. From the point of view of people of faith, our main issue, a powerful issue, I don't say main issue, it's a powerful issue, has to do with a kind of a secularization and at all levels of government, of the different branches of government, a coldness where the human person is treated as more a what than a who. And there are people now more liable to be disposable, as Pope Francis has often spoken of. This, a culture of throwing away people who do not, throwing away stuff that's not needed anymore, not wanted anymore, more not wanted than needed. And the idea that in a society we can throw away people who don't match whatever is set up as the norm. They become unworthy, let's say. Their life, and they may themselves feel, my life is not worth anything. And our mission here in the midst, we're dealing with the government, the Supreme Court unanimously voted in favor of euthanasia. And we're seeing the ripple effect of that down through our country. All kinds of people are being put in terrible situations, and people are being felt, old people being made to feel, even unconsciously, maybe subtly, I don't want to be a burden. Well, let me out. I don't want to be a burden. And also when people are in great discouragement because of physical pain, only I think about 30% of Canadians have access to any palliative care, let alone good palliative care. Those are things we can provide. And what we people of faith can provide is an assurance through action that you're not a burden. You're not a, I think of that, always think of that poster, I know it was from the 1930s from Boys Town, where you see a young man carrying another one, and he said, he's not heavy, he's my brother. It's how you look at it that makes the difference. And that doesn't require millions of dollars. It doesn't require soldiers and buildings and institutions. It requires what people of faith have in abundance, and that is love. And I think that also is what is true in refugees too. But the issue of the political thing of this, I'm afraid I don't really, for many reasons, I don't think I can comment on it because I don't really have the competence to do that. So I think maybe this will be the last question because we're over the time a bit and I have to move.
Basically, I'm a Canadian from Ottawa, and I worked as CEO for 27 years. And I would say that writing a letter to the President of the United States is actually useless. But we can do something in Canada. I think we have done that when the Vietnamese refugees came. We had done that when the Syrian refugees came. In our parish and parishes around that, we can, and even in Ottawa, our mayors have said we will take so many people. We can say, can step up and say, and we can play a role in Canada stepping up and playing. Let's take at least a certain number of immigrants from that caravan into Canada and ask the churches and the people of Canada to support that thing. That's something we can do. We don't need to talk about other issues. Yes, we have. Our Canadian government has been, Trudeau particularly, will be very, very forthcoming to be able to show that even though Trump failed, we can do it. And I think Trudeau will have a influence on the Mexican president too, because we are together in the North American Treaty Organization.
Well, he may very well. I don't know. I know that we have done, we've helped out many different people, and I don't think we can compare, I don't know how to compare the situations. One of the auxiliary bishops in my diocese here, indeed, is Bishop Vincent Nguyen, was one of the boat people from Vietnam. We have done this. In each case, however, you have to determine, as the things I was saying before, what is the right thing to do. And I know in this diocese, when we asked for financial support for helping refugees from the Middle East, we tried to raise $3 million, and we were given $4 million by the people. And we put that to practical use by caring for people. But that decision about who gets into the country is a government decision. But we are ready to help people in need, and we've been that way. I think all different religions, I can only speak for my own, but I mean others I'm sure the same, for many, many years. So it's an important thing we need to do, and pray the Lord to bless everyone and seek us to do that. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cardinal Collins. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Have a great evening.